Welcome, everybody. Today we're going to be talking to none other than Dr. Dennis Harness, author of the Nakshatras, Lunar Mansions of Vedic Astrology. We're going to be talking to Dr. Harness about his background and his approach to Vedic astrology, as well as the integration of the fields of psychology and Vedic astrology, and how the study of the two of these disciplines can assist us in unlocking the secrets of the mind. So here we go, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me today. I have with me an awesome guest. I'm very excited to have him here on this channel and count him as one of my friends. He is author of the acclaimed book in the astrology community, the Nakshatras, the Lunar Mansions of Vedic Astrology. He is a psychologist and a counselor, which gives him a very solid edge when he is doing his astrology consultations with his clients. He's also a very well-known Vedic astrologer, yogi, public lecturer. He also organizes conferences, and he's one of the founding members of the ACVA, which is an association in the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, I give to you Dr. Dennis Harness. Dennis, thanks for joining us today.
It's great to see you again, Joey. Appreciate inviting me.
Oh, thank you so much for joining. And what I wanted to do, because you've done these interviews before, and I kind of wanted to approach things from a different angle today. But first, I would really like to know a little bit more about your background and your spiritual journey and what led you to study Vedic astrology.
I always jokingly say it was that lifetime in Tibet, that past life, really, but there's actually truth to that. But anyway, in this lifetime, I came across autobiography of a yogi when I was about 20 years old. So this dates me a little bit. It was 1975 when I was given this book. And when I was reading it, I came across a chapter, it was just chapter 16, called Outwitting the Stars. And I read it, and it just really impacted me because I'd had an interest in astrology since about the age of 12. I memorized the sun signs and things like that as a kid. And I always knew that there was a strong interest in astrology, and I got into studying it, a bit and things when I was in my early 20s. But that chapter really affected me strongly. And so that, I would say, is what was one of the catapults, into the field of astrology. And then I had a couple of girlfriends that were into astrology, so that also helped to push me along in terms of direction. So in 1980, I was taking a yoga teacher's training course. It was a 3-month course up at Ananda, which is up in Nevada City, California, Northern California, Swami Kriyananda's spiritual community. And I gave a talk there. We had to do a presentation right at the end of the training, and I gave a talk on astrology, and I was looking at Yogananda's chart and Sri Yukteswar's charts. And Swami Kriyananda was there to hear the presentations. And so after the presentation, he came up to me and he said, I really like what you're doing with this, and I really encourage you to continue to study astrology. He said, but I think you need to meet a man named Chakrapani Ulal. Who was Swami Muktananda's astrologer. And so this was 1980. So I was about 24 years old. And he said, he gave me his phone number, and I called and I made an appointment with him down in Santa Monica, California, which is where Muktananda's ashram kind of was at that point. So I went down to see Chakrapani, and it was just an amazing experience. I got so much Shakti. My Kundalini was arising, wow, as I spoke with him. And he told me, about 2 minutes into the session, he said, you will be married twice. And I hadn't even been engaged once. So it was a little disconcerting for me. And then a little bit further into the session, he said, I know your mind very well, perhaps better than you. And by the end of the session, he had convinced me that there was some truth to that. Wow. So it was like my opening to Vedic astrology. But at the time, I was so naive I didn't realize there was a difference between Western astrology and Vedic or Hindu astrology, as it was called at that point in time. I didn't realize there was a difference between the tropical and sidereal zodiac, because I'm sure some of your students and participants or people on the program will know that there is this difference. But for those of you that are new to astrology, there's about almost a 24-degree difference now between the two systems. So anyway, I was really interested in Vedic astrology, but at that point, there weren't many books out in 1980 that were written by Western authors. So I kind of put it on the back burner and continued to study and get my degree in psychology and sociology, and continued my studies on into behavioral medicine, which is the application of behavior therapy to healthcare. Long story short, it just kind of pushed me into it, but it wasn't until 1987, 88, when I came across a book by James Braha called Ancient Hindu Astrology for the Modern Western Astrologer. And then that was a bridge for me into bringing Western astrology, which I'd been studying, during this time, and Vedic astrology or Hindu astrology. So that's basically what kind of, was the impetus for me to get into the study of Vedic astrology. And then I got to take James's workshop, and I got to teach with him, and I started organizing the conferences back in '92 on international symposiums on Vedic astrology, and had all these great teachers coming from India as well as from the United States. And so that's basically kind of my path that led me more in depth into, focusing on doing it professionally.
Wow. Okay. So you're a psychologist, and you practice astrology as part of your, as part of your consultations, which sort of makes you unique in several respects. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it's like to integrate the two different schools of thought together, and maybe talk about the advantages of, how that has enriched your professional counseling practice.
Well, I think one of the goals of psychotherapy and astrology, or counseling and astrology, is to make the unconscious conscious, to bring things up to the forefront so that people can make, how would we say, I think one of the goals of astrology, and actually psychology for that matter, is to help the client take discriminative action in their life. So that's a big kind of aspect of it. Secondly, as Carl Jung said in a letter that he wrote to B.V. Raman, he said that, this was back in 1946, Carl Jung being the famous Swiss psychiatrist, and B.V. Raman being one of the most famous Vedic astrologers of the 20th century. And then this letter that Dr. Raman showed me, and I actually have a copy of that letter, Jung said, to paraphrase Jung, he said, in cases of difficult psychological diagnosis, I often use the chart to show me and to cast light on those areas that I wouldn't have been able to uncover, or would have taken me a long time to uncover doing traditional psychotherapy. And he said, I often found that the chart elucidated these deeper kind of complexes, psychological complexes. So we see that the chart kind of really is sometimes a blueprint of the psychological issues that may be going on for the client. So it allows me, it's kind of like a, number one, a diagnostic tool, which we can talk about more in depth during this interview. And it's also comes part and parcel of the whole development of working with a client. Because the problem with astrology is that one of the problems is that it's set up to where you just see a client maybe at best once a year. Sometimes I've had one client that came back after 25 years. So we have this model of astrology that you're supposed to do all these things in one session, know their past, present, and future, and be able to offer remedial measures and do all these things, in 1 hour. And I think we need to develop a model where we can see clients over the course of time.
Right.
You know, like in India, you know, the astrologer is set up to see people, and sometimes the family will come maybe once a month, maybe once every couple of months, and there'll be an ongoing relationship with that astrologer. So I'm seeing that that model can really be more effective, where you can see things over the long run. So Jung, you know, his daughter was a famous astrologer in Zurich.
I did not know that.
And so again, she would often analyze the charts of the patients as well as the analysts. So she became very famous in Zurich, and she was a Western astrologer. But again, Jung really had a love of astrology, and it came out through his daughter even more.
Oh, that's beautiful. I didn't know that about his daughter.
Yeah.
So this is a bit of a side question, but you know, since I've known you for the past year and a half or so, I've always kind of wanted to ask you this question. So, you know, in your formative spiritual years, you studied Paramahansa Yogananda's teachings, and you know, you mentioned Outwitting the Stars, which is an amazing chapter in the autobiography of Yogi. But how has your practice of Yogananda's teachings of self-realization molded your approach to the study of astrology?
Well, he's been kind of a balance for me, because, you know, sometimes astrology can be, particularly Vedic astrology, well, Western as well, can be very predictive. And you can see certain factors in the chart that are most likely going to occur. But how you interpret them and how you reframe them to a client is essential. So Yogananda, he tells the story in autobiography, which always had a strong impact on me, where he was told by the astrologer in his village that he would be married 3 times and twice a widower. And he took his chart and he wadded it up and he threw it into a fire. And he said, the seeds of my past karma cannot grow in the fires of divine wisdom. But on 3 different occasions, his family tried to get him married to 3 different women, and he refused that. And you could see in his chart, it's a very difficult chart for marriage. I could go into the details of it, but just suffice it to say it's a kind of a troubled chart for marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And Yogananda wanted to be married to Divine Mother. So again, he chose that path rather than the path of marriage. So again, he had a strong influence on me to not get so locked into seeing things in a fatalistic way. And of course, the practice of meditation and yoga that was taught by Yogananda and by Self-Realization Fellowship has also had a strong impact on me. Because in a way, the chakras in our body, the 7 chakras, are aligned with the planets. For example, Saturn is connected with the root chakra. Venus and Jupiter are connected with the 2nd chakra. The solar plexus is connected with the Mars and the Sun. Saturn and Venus are connected with the heart, because heart is love, but it's also detachment. And so on and on. Mercury is connected with the throat, and Moon and Jupiter are connected with the 3rd eye. And then finally, the Sun and Ketu are connected with the crown chakra. So there's a whole chakra system aligned with the planetary energies. So let's just say, for example, Saturn is very weak in the chart. That may indicate that the person needs to focus more on Muladhara or grounding kind of techniques to help strengthen the Saturn energy, which may be vulnerable in the chart.
Okay. Wow.
So you can unite yoga and the philosophy into the chart, because also sometimes the chart will reveal, Joey, the path, the spiritual path that the person may be drawn to. For example, if the person has a very strong Venus and Moon, they may be more bhakti oriented or more devotional. You know, where if they have a very strong Mercury, they may be more connected with Gyan or the path of wisdom. So you can sometimes even see the paths of yoga that may be associated with the person's natal chart.
Oh, wow. That's wonderful. That's, one of the things that I've noticed, my observations from going to astrologers, which started, my love affair with astrology started in about 2012, but it didn't really cement itself. I didn't really start studying astrology until 2015, but a lot of my initial consultations were very predictive, and I found, as you mentioned, when you start going into more of the deeper understanding of a person's temperament and their karmic blind spots, they really start to, that's where the value of astrology really unfolds itself.
Mm-hmm.
So this actually is a good segue into the topic that I wanted to talk with you today on mental health and astrology. So I know that this is probably a huge lecture into itself, but I'm just wondering if there's any insight or wisdom you can share with us. When you're looking at a person's Rashi chart for the first time, can you describe what things that you look at or do to evaluate the mental health of an individual?
I'm going to be lecturing on this at our upcoming conference in Sedona at end of November of this year. Kind of looking at the psychological aspects through Vedic astrology. And one of the first things we look at in a chart is the ascendant, or the lagna, the rising sign. And because the ascendant or the rising sign, as Hart Defoe, the great Vedic astrologer, said, he called it the stumbha, which is the root or the pillar in which the whole chart is built. So we're going to get into the sample chart later about the gentleman Chester Bennington.
Mm-hmm.
But for example, just to use his chart to bring this out, just in terms of this one issue, he happens to have in his natal chart in the first house Rahu. And Rahu sometimes in the first house, because the first house is so strong in terms of the person's foundation, can create some ups and downs, we could say like that. I'm not saying that he was necessarily bipolar, but sometimes Rahu in the first house can indicate that. We could say mood disorder would be a better way to put it, because you can get into all different kinds of classifications, of course, of mood disorders, from depression to anxiety to bipolar to even schizophrenia in rare cases. But the first house we look at is so important. Secondly, the ruling planet of the first house, where that planet is placed. So for example, if it's placed in a Dushtana, house of difficulty, 6, 8, or 12, all things being equal, that may be a little bit more troubled for the person. Of course, you'd have to look and see what planet is involved, and again, how that planet, what essential dignities that planet has. Is it in a strong sign? Does it have good aspects made to it? Things like that, which may override this placement of the ruler of the first house in the Dushtana, 6, 8, 12. Secondly, we look at the fourth house, because the fourth house is one's sense of emotional happiness and contentment. It's also the house of the mother, because if that's disturbed, it can indicate difficulties with the mother. It can also indicate difficulties with the person's happiness and contentment. Again, we could use the example of Rahu. I had a client who came in the other day who has Rahu in the fourth house. And he was having pretty much a full-blown manic episode as he was in my office, which was a lot of fun. No, it's actually not too much fun. Actually, it's a little scary, to be honest. But he was talking, 100 miles an hour and, just some other kind of telltale signs of something that was going wrong for him. So the fourth house is also connected with one's emotional well-being. According to Chakrapani law, which I haven't done as much work with this, but he also connected the fifth house with emotional issues. And maybe because the fifth house is connected with creative intelligence, this may be one of the reasons why. I wished I would have asked him that, because he just died recently. I always wanted to ask him, but I never got around to it, why he emphasized the fifth house. Because I could understand the first and the fourth, but the fifth I didn't quite ever grasp. So maybe it's because it's the house of children, and that can make you a little crazy. I always say it's BC before children, and then it's AC after children. It becomes AC/DC, rock and roll. So maybe that's it. I just had that insight. It's the children. It's all their fault. Things that push us over the edge.
Yeah.
The other factors, of course, that are important are the moon, because the moon is our mind, it's manas, it's how we perceive the world based on memory, based on past experience, based on the relationship with the mother. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to put the mother in the whole mix of psychological issues, but quite often the mother is the chief mechanism of socialization, because quite often the father's gone, he's at work, he's not available, to the child. So it falls on the mother's shoulders a lot, although that's been changing a lot over the last few decades of more fathers, being at home with their kids, and the woman more in the workforce and that kind of thing.
Right.
But the moon, again, is a very big hitter in terms of emotional, of course, as you can imagine, issues. Mercury is also very important, because Mercury is the rational mind, the analytical mind. So those two planets have their say. And of course, Saturn would be associated with depression, which we can talk about a little bit more in detail later. And also Mars could be connected with issues with anger and things like that. Also, some manic kind of energies can come with Mars, if Mars is say with Mercury or something like that, or with the moon. It can bring up issues. But again, issues with anger management can be important working through of that. So those are some of the just basic things that I look at. And then finally, because I love the nakshatras, I look a lot at the moon, particularly the moon and the rising sign nakshatras. And to see, because some of those nakshatras tend to be a little bit more difficult for psychological issues. Some of the more challenging nakshatras like Ardra or Aslesha or Jeshta, some of these nakshatras that tend to be more tikshna or sharp in their edge, they tend to be a little bit more vulnerable to psychological disturbance.
Okay. Oh, that's great. And we talked a little bit about the moon, but also the other thing that I kind of wanted to know a little bit more about is the importance of the moon cycles. So if the moon is considered more benefic on the waxing side, or full moon or new moon, how much will that weigh into, a person's mental state?
Generally from the Vedic point of view, it's better to be born under a waxing moon. And particularly about 5 days into the waxing or after the new moon. So about 5 days in tends to be better for the moon. And since the moon rules emotions and things like that, and one's perceptual mind, more the right brain, a little bit more than the left brain. I would say that being said, it's generally better to be born towards a waxing moon, towards a full moon. Oh. However, being born under exactly a full moon gets a little bit wacky. Any of your viewers that have a full moon, don't worry. Generally it's considered more auspicious, more positive. But again, it can be a little challenging to be born exactly under a full moon. The waning moon tends to be a little bit more difficult. And when it gets into a balsamic moon, which is about 4 or 5 days before the new moon, it can create more of a melancholy mind. And some difficulties, again, with the mother, because the moon is mom. So the mother may have struggled with depression or something like that, we could say.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I really became aware of it yesterday. I think we had full moon in Purva Falguni, I think, in Leo. And I really felt it yesterday. But it was an intense It was an intense, but it was in a good way, because I think it was like crossing my ascendant. So
yeah. It was in Purva Falguni yesterday. It just shifted today actually into Uttara. So the moon is in Leo. And it's a little more dramatic too when the moon is in Leo. So depending on the sign as well as the nakshatra, of course, it'll have, like you said, it'll have its flavoring.
Right.
So.
Okay, so the next thing that I wanted to talk about, so you've talked about, things that you examine the Rashi chart. We look at, the different planets and their karaka as an indication and how that can tie into a person's mental states. How much do you weigh in on divisional charts, the Navamsha and potentially other charts to see?
I'm kind of a psychologist that uses astrology. So some of the divisional charts, I primarily use like Drakana and Navamsha and Dashamsa, which is connected more with career, actually. But the career can have a strong effect on one's psychological well-being, particularly for men who, well, even women now, that really we prove our masculinity sometimes through our work. And if the job karma is difficult, of course, that's going to have its effect on the psychological well-being of the person. But my main emphasis is more on the Navamsha chart. And Navamsha, which is the ninth harmonic, they always say is associated with marriage karma. And which, Parashara says that, and Brahmira and some of the other great sages, so I have to honor that tradition. But I always thought the Navamsha chart, because it's the ninth harmonic, would be connected with the ninth house, whereas the Dashamsa is connected with the 10th harmonic with the 10th house, career. So I look at the Navamsha as one's deeper spiritual nature. And it's kind of like the Rashi is the tree and the Navamsha is like the fruit of the tree. And so if a planet, let's just say, is really strong in the Rashi, but weak in the Navamsha, that person may win the kingdom but lose their soul. They may have some spiritual kinds of challenges that come. So I'm always looking to see if there's a planet particularly afflicted in the Navamsha, that may still show up as a challenge where it's not showing up in the Rashi chart. So I do use that as kind of a backdrop, but my main focus is primarily on the Rashi chart. I also use what's called the Bhava chart, which is the house chart, which sometimes planets will shift houses in what's called the Bhava chart. But that, again, gets a little more technical. But to answer your question, I think there's been amazing work that's been done on the divisional charts. I think Sam Jeppe has done some really good work, and I think he's actually going to be lecturing at that at UAC. We're doing an all-day thing to support the American College of Vedic Astrology. And I know Sam's done some work with that, and Camilla Sutton, and a lot of other astrologers have got into some of the minutiae of some of these divisional charts, even the 64th, divisional chart. I mean, you have to be so accurate with the birth time to get accurate information with some of those higher divisional charts that I kind of stay more through the Dashamsa. That's enough to create a challenge for me, being kind of a simple guy from Kansas City, Missouri. My wife calls me a Midwestern mystic,
Nice. Oh, that's good. So moving on, I also wanted to talk a little bit about the influence of Saraswati because, there's some of the Saturn transits. So when Saturn is crossing the person's natal moon, there's that 7.5-year period, which is, can be challenging depending on your planetary placements. And then there's also Ashtama Shani and Kantaka Shani, which is 8th house transit from the moon or Lagna, as well as the 4th house transit from the moon or Lagna. In general, it's my observation that these Saturn-moon conjunctions or relationships can lead to issues. We had mentioned that Saturn is the karaka of stress and that kind of thing, and moon is the mana. So I can see the influence there, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about Saraswati and how these Saturn transits play in to how a person can feel.
Yeah, Saraswati actually, as you mentioned, actually translates as 7.5 years. And it's when Saturn moves into the house or the sign before the moon, the sign of the moon, and the sign after the moon. Actually, K.N. Rao taught me a technique which is kind of gets a little bit more precise. He said it's when Saturn gets within 45 degrees of the moon till 45 degrees after the moon, which again would be 90 degrees, which would be 3 signs, but it gets a little bit more specific. So anyway, I just wanted to toss that into the analysis here. But the idea is that I had my students up at Kepler College up in Seattle write a paper on it of when the last time they went through Saraswati and what happened. And it was very interesting for them to, and particularly I was interested when it was in the sign of the moon or going exactly over the moon. And to be honest, 9 times out of 10, it wasn't a picnic, it wasn't a cakewalk. There was something that was going on in the physical plane that was harsh. It could have been a death of a loved one. It could have been a loss of a job. It could have been the person went through some depression or melancholy period. So it's not an easy transit. However, one of my teachers, who was the Subramanya Swami, who was the head of the Kauai Hindu monastery in the Hawaiian Islands, he said that he felt that Saraswati was the most important transit for spiritual growth because it can, if used properly, help to strip away the ego. And, you know, it's so it has its positive effect, but usually a little bit more from a spiritual level. And it can cause change in the lifetime and the ego in one's life, but the ego doesn't really want to change. And so sometimes, as Carl Jung would say, the birth of consciousness does not occur without pain. It sounds a little masochistic or sadistic, but the truth is that quite often, yeah, we don't want to change until we feel some pain. And I actually say whenever somebody comes from an astrology session, it's usually, they haven't usually just won the lottery, you know, they're going through some difficulty. So Saraswati, you know, just on a general level, can bring some of these issues. When Saturn's going through the 4th house from the moon or the ascendant, 4th house being one's, as we were mentioning, emotional well-being, again, it can be a time where the person may go through some depression. Or I had one client recently with Leo Lagna, and could be moon in Leo as well. Saturn was in the sign of Scorpio, 4th from the moon, which can create some emotional turbulence, can indicate sometimes some difficulties around the home. This one client of mine actually separated from his wife and lived in a separate residence during that time. And then once Saturn moved on through Scorpio into Sagittarius, they came back together. So, you know, it can often put pressure on 4th house issues. And then finally, Saturn in the 8th from the moon can indicate having to deal with a death or loss, because the 8th house is connected with death, rebirth kinds of issues. Can indicate health issues sometimes too. And again, this will be exacerbated if, say, Saturn was in Scorpio, which was a tough sign for Saturn to be in those 2.5 years we just got out of, you know, last fall. Mm-hmm. So anyway, you can probably speak to that with Leo, you know, and I have Leo rising, so I can speak to it as well.
I lost, you know, my last corporate job, although there was some level of planning involved just because of the advantage of having the astrology. And of course, you know, when you came to Toronto, we did spend some time together and we talked about it a little bit as well. But literally when Shani changed signs, within 2 days of Shani changing signs, I lost my job. So the timing, you know, was basically right on schedule.
Yeah.
But there's been tremendous growth since then.
Exactly.
And you know, while Leo rising, Saturn rules 6th and 7th house, so it's, you know, work and relationships definitely have been you know, themes for me. There's so much opportunity for growth. Thanks for watching. Please stay tuned for part 2, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a thing. Have a blissful day.